Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third evening of our Not Equal Summer webinar series, running in conjunction with the Not Equal Summer School on Social Justice and the Digital Economy. For those who are new to this webinar series and the Not Equal Network Plus, I am Clara Crivellaro, and I've been working with Unlight, Lizzie Colcamp and Alan Dix for the past 3 years on the Not Equal Network Plus. Not Equal is a £1.2 million UKRI funded network project that aims at exploring and creating the conditions to support social justice in the digital economy. And we have done this through enabling over 16 collaborations between academic and non-academic organizations and communities, as well as fostering a number of smaller and larger scales events, engagements, and initiatives, which are resulting in new processes and new models for community engagement and novel explorations and responses that we hope will advance justice and equity in our digital society. So Anne and I have worked together on this summer school, which has the added benefit of a webinar series, and perhaps thanks to the pandemic, we have been able to bring together speakers from around the world addressing the broader theme of social justice and the digital technology. So each webinar evening explores a different theme, and the theme for this evening is making data work for social justice. We are going to record the session this evening, as we'd like to make it available to those who perhaps couldn't join us this evening, and being able to disseminate these ideas as much as possible. So we are very honored to have two amazing speakers joining us this evening. Catherine D'Ignazio from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Giselle Cory, Executive Director of DataKind UK, who will share with us their perspectives, ideas and experiences of making data science work for equity and social justice. So this is how the evening is going to work. I will introduce each speaker who will talk for about 25 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes. And after each speaker, we are going to have 10 minutes for Q&A. And at the end, I'd like to bring both Catherine and Giselle together for a brief discussion and any further questions you may want to ask. Okay, so I am going to end my slideshow now, and I'd like to welcome Catherine D'Ignazio, who is going to talk to us about data feminism, which is a way of thinking about data science and its communication that is informed by the past several decades of intersectional feminist activism and critical thought. Catherine D'Ignazio is an assistant professor of urban science and planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. She's also director of the Data Plus Feminism Lab, which uses data and computational methods to work towards gender and racial equity, particularly as they relate to space and place. D'Ignazio is a scholar, artist, designer, and hacker mama who focuses on feminist technology, data literacy, and civic engagement. Thank you very much, Catherine, for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Clara. Thanks to Anne. Thanks to all the participants for spending some of your precious Zoom time with me and with us today. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Let's move you all so I can see you. Okay, good. So I'm going to talk for a bit today about Lauren Klein and I's book, Data Feminism, but we were just talking before this, and I'm also happy to talk about other projects. You know, time is short, so also happy to bring up other work that I don't discuss today. But today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book, tell you a little bit about our motivations for writing the book, give you some of examples that come out of the book that connect to our principles, and then looking forward to the conversation with Giselle after that. Okay, let me just turn off notifications. There we go. So I think the important thing to say here on this first slide is just that, as you can see, the book is co-authored. The co-author is Lauren F. Klein. She's a professor at Emory University. And she runs a really excellent lab in digital humanities called the Digital Humanities Lab. So if you don't know her work, you should definitely go check it out. She has a whole new book in the works that's coming out this year. Very impressive. The other thing to say about this slide is that Data Feminism is actually open access, so you do not need to purchase it to read it. If you go to the website here at the bottom of the slide, datafeminism.io, there'll be a big button that says read the book, and you can just click there and it'll take you right to the open access version of the book. All right, so to get started, Lauren and I see data feminism as really part of a growing body of work that is working to hold corporate and government actors accountable, basically for making sexist, racist, and classist data products. So these are things like face detection systems that cannot see women of color, hiring algorithms that demote applicants that went to all women's schools, child abuse detection algorithms that punish poor parents, data visualizations that reinforce the gender binary, and many more things. And part of what motivated us to write the book is that these examples keep coming. So the popular press, you know, almost every week, at least here in the United States, there's another example of how this or that algorithmic system or this or that data-driven product has failed women, has failed people of color, has failed immigrants, has failed LGBTQ folks, and so on. And often these things keep getting reported in the same way, with like this thing of like shock and surprise and like, how could an algorithm be biased? Oh my God, like what's happening with our technology? And so what Lauren and I wanted to do is to sort of back up, right? And to think about, well, how do we actually expect that from a racist and sexist society, we will be producing racist and sexist products unless we actually start to examine these forces of oppression and how they show up in our information systems in just the same way that they show up in so many other aspects of our world. And we are not the only ones sort of doing this kind of pushback and this bringing of a kind of analytic of power into data science. And here on the bottom of the slide, you can see a lot of the work that was inspirational to us as we were writing is here at the bottom. There's folks who have been really starting to address this in major ways through creative works and poetry, through academic work, through activism and advocacy, and so on. And really what a lot of this work is doing, and we would put data feminism here as well, is to push back on what is essentially a meme. And the meme is this phrase here at the top of the slide, data is the new oil. I don't know how many of you have heard this. It was a really popular meme in like the early 2010s and has been kind of circulating, especially in like corporate data science circles for quite some time at this point. And it's a really interesting metaphor and narrative for what data are. You know, the folks that use this like The Economist magazine, for example, they tend to use this in a very positive way. So they see oil as a good thing, and they are saying that making this parallel with oil. And in fact, the parallel is really interesting because a lot of our metaphors that we use with data are those same metaphors of extraction that we use with oil. So we extract data, we mine data, we clean data, we refine data, we process data, and so on and so forth. And so this sort of imagines data as this sort of untapped, quote unquote, natural resource. And the promise of the new oil is profit, right? So we're looking at so we can mine this natural resource and then it will yield us these great profits. But of course, just as with oil, the question from a feminist perspective is profits for whom? Right? And so this is why we see women, and particularly women of color in this space, Indigenous people, immigrant communities, and more, experiencing this as the same old oppression. So in fact, instead of, kind of boosting all of us equally, data in fact are accelerating and exacerbating the same old oppression that we've been living under more or less for centuries. And so what our contribution is really to do is to explain what feminism and intersectional feminism in particular can offer this kind of emerging critique and pushback and integration of power into how we think about data science. So what we try to do at the beginning of a talk, so whenever we talk about feminism, people have various and diverse experiences of this word. We inherit various and diverse stereotypes about what feminism is and who are feminists. And so we like to kind of lay out what is our grounding in feminist, both theory and action. And so what we like to do is show this image from the 2014 MTV Music Awards when Beyonce projected the word feminist behind her. And in fact, if you go back and listen to Flawless, the very popular song, she's actually sampling a speech from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who herself is quoting the dictionary definition of what is or who is a feminist. And it's really simply this. So a feminist is the person who believes in equal rights for men and women and non-binary people. And so what we get from this is that feminism is a belief in equality for all genders. But there's a second definition, which is that feminism is also organized activity on behalf of women's and non-binary people's rights and interests. Meaning, if you look around you, if you believe in gender equality, look around you, you will see, it's really plain that we have not realized that world in which we have gender equality. And so feminism implies a commitment to take action on behalf of realizing that world. So feminism is a belief and it's also political action. And then feminism has a third definition, which is one I find very exciting, which is that it's a series or is a set of theories and ideas. And so the theories begin by thinking about issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender. But the past 40 years of scholarship and our current political reality have brought many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation, including race, class, sexuality, ability, and many more things. And so this leads to the sort of takeaway of sort of which feminism, whose feminism are we mobilizing in data feminism? We are drawing specifically from intersectional feminism. And as folks may or may not know, I don't know how new this concept of intersectionality is to this particular audience, but I'll explain it. So intersectionality is a term coined by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, and that's her here on the bottom right. And she uses it to explain how social inequality cannot be explained by only one dimension of difference like gender. And so when we talk about inequality or oppression, we have to talk about the intersection of many forces and factors that produce it. So this means, Crenshaw, when she was writing specifically about the experiences of Black women in the United States who, Black women experiences of oppression cannot be explained by just having a kind of power analytic around gender relations, because of course they're also needing to deal with racism as a kind of part of everyday life. And so she's writing about how these forces of sexism and racism combine, and they combine in sort of non-linear ways in order to produce oppression. And so it's really the work of women of color feminists and Black feminists in particular that have foregrounded this conversation about forces of power. And so that's what kind of, if we're drawing from intersectional feminism, the implication of that is that it's not only about women, it's actually not only about gender even, but it's really about power. It's about who has power and who does not have power. And so in today's world, data is power. And we can see this in just a really clear material way, which is like, if you look at which companies are making the most money right now in the world, they are the companies that are that have the resources to collect, store, analyze, mobilize, deploy large amounts of data. So data-driven products and systems and so on. And so the kind of main argument of the book is that intersectional feminism, when applied to data science, can help that power, that unequal power, be challenged and changed. And so in fact, our argument is that data science needs feminism, and it needs intersectional feminism in particular, if we ever hope to overturn these power imbalances. And that's what we would say in terms of the space of like, what do we mean by data for good? We would say, well, that is data for justice. That is data that is challenging the unequal distribution of power and working to rectify that. So as we wrote the book, we looked across a whole variety of fields. So, like I said, that one of the definitions of feminism is that it's an intellectual heritage, which is exciting. And it means that we can go out and we can find feminist work across just a huge range of fields. So everything from geography and cartography to economics to legal scholarship to, of course, the humanities and arts and literature, social sciences, just feminism is in many places. And we, in particular, as we wrote the book, we scanned fields that had tried to, we might call like operationalized feminism, like kind of build a feminist perspective into something that's more applied. So we looked like, for example, at like human computer interaction and design fields, where we're trying to think about like, well, how do we bring a kind of feminist perspective into the actual practice of data science? And from that scan, we came up with these 7 principles that for us encapsulate the most important aspects of feminism as they relate to data science. The goal here being to, like I said, operationalize feminism, to kind of say, well, like, if we take feminist theory really seriously, like, what does that mean for how we work with data? And so I won't have time in this talk to go through all of the different principles, but this is actually the way that the book is organized. So each of these principles corresponds to one chapter of the book. And what we try to do in each chapter is introduce the reader. We try to assume no prior knowledge. So we try to introduce the reader to who are the feminist thinkers that have kind of really shaped this particular principle, who have really talked about, let's say, examining power. And then who are the people who are out there already working with data and data science or data visualization in ways that actually embody that principle. So we try to do a lot in each chapter to illustrate these principles through examples of work in the world. And then I think the other thing I'll say is that you'll notice that the first 2 principles, the first 2 chapters of the book, again, are about power. So examine power and challenge power. And this is because this analytic of power, like I was saying, that is the core analytic of the kind of what feminism brings, is really centers on unequal power relations. And so I've occasionally gotten in talks the question of like, well, why is data feminism principles, why are they different from just like regular good data science? And this is the answer to that question, which is that regular good data science, at least not yet, does not center power. We don't typically talk about sexism and racism and colonialism in sort of mainstream intro to data science classes. Now, hopefully that's changing. So like, hopefully your all summer school is participating in that change. And so maybe one day it will be just kind of like rolled into good, what is considered good. So yes, so I think from here, I'm just going to show just a couple of examples and show you a little bit about how the kind of examples that we bring to bear on these principles. So for the principle of examine power, we talk about projects like this one. So this is a project called the Library of Missing Data Sets by an artist named Mimi Onuoha. And so this idea of missing data sets, this is a term that Onuoha coined to describe data sets that, a reasonable person might expect them to exist because they address issues of pressing social need. But because of various reasons, they don't actually exist in real life. So these are things like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, or people excluded from public housing because of criminal records, or for a more topical example, a gender and race breakdown of the number of people with COVID in the United States. Or for a more topical example, Florida just stopped publishing their COVID cases. So we don't know how many people in Florida have COVID, et cetera. So Onuoha exhibits the Library of Missing Data Sets both as a GitHub repository, which you see on the right, and then also as an art installation. And so this is the file cabinet that you see on the left. And each of these files are labeled with the titles of the data sets that are missing. And so you can, when you're in the museum or the art exhibition, you can open this filing cabinet. You can go through the file folders, you can take one out and open it up. But of course, when you open it up, they're empty because we actually have no records about these particular topics. And the reason that they're empty, and Mimi's written really eloquently about this, is because of this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world today. So it's worth thinking about how data are connected to resources. Who has the resources to store and collect large amounts of data? Governments have this power, moneyed institutions have this power, minoritized groups often do not have this power. And so one of the points that we try to make in this Examine Power chapter is around how, well, there's a lot of conversation that's very important happening around algorithmic bias, right? Like how do we get these like racist data products? Those are important conversations to have, but it's also important to think holistically about like the kind of whole data collection environment or ecosystem, and think about there's also bias in what we do not collect data about. There are data silences and data absences, and this is also a place where sort of bias is entering into the sort of ecosystem. Okay, the next example I'm going to talk about is coming from the second chapter, which is about challenging power. So sort of think about like once we've examined power and understood how power functions on a particular topic or in a particular context, how do we use data science or data communication to challenge that power? And this actually also has to do with the case of missing data sets. So this project is by Maria Salguero, who is based in Mexico. And the topic of, it's about the topic of feminicide, which if you don't know, feminicides are gender-related killings of women and girls. They include cis and trans women. They are legally defined as crimes in actually 18 countries in Latin America, which is basically thanks to the strength of the Latin American feminist movement, who's really put this issue on the public agenda. However, in Mexico, as in many other places, the state does not systematically collect data about feminicide, meaning like they have laws on the books, but they're actually not, haven't dedicated any resources to measuring the scope and scale of the problem, nor to actually adequately classifying it. And you can check this out with the hashtag Ni Una Menos, shows some of this. You can see some of the sort of public dialogue around this. So Maria Salguero was frustrated by this sort of lack of action, lack of data collection. And in 2015, she started compiling feminicides in her country by logging them on a Google map, and basically just by reading news articles that reported about women's deaths. And so she has now been doing this work for 6 years. She spends around 2 to 4 hours a day logging these and reading these news reports and logging deaths in this Google map. And she's ended up with her data, in fact, she's amassed the largest public repository of feminicide in the Mexican context. So she's ended up helping families locate loved ones. She's provided data to journalists and NGOs. And she's actually been invited to testify in front of Mexico's Congress multiple times, which I find so ironic because she's like doing their job for them. And so they want to learn from her about how they could do their job. But so in the book, we talk about this as kind of feminist counter data. So like this idea of counter data, that's not our idea. We're drawing from prior work on counter data. And this is a kind of an activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of their population. And so this idea of collecting counter data represents one way to use data to challenge power. There's an important caveat here, though, which is that the answer to some kind of social problem is not necessarily collect more data, right? So it's really important to say, and we try to communicate in the book, that data really they're a double-edged sword in the sense that what might be made visible by data might expose vulnerable populations to targeting, hate crimes, more surveillance, and so on. And so it's not necessarily a given that like all counter data collection is emancipatory and a good thing to do. And then I just wanted to take the opportunity to say, in fact, I was so interested, when we were doing this work with writing up and researching Maria Salguero and talking with her, I started talking with other folks, and we realized that Maria Salguero is not the only person or group that's doing this feminicide counter data collection work. And so this is a space where my lab and I have started to work in, where we've started to conduct interviews with the feminicide data activists, mainly in Latin America, but there are a number also in the United States, a handful in Europe. We just interviewed one group in Africa recently as well. And the group's methods, although they're not, most of them are not connected to each other, their methods are very similar, where many of them are monitoring feminicide based on news reports and social media reports. And so what that's led us to do is start these co-design workshops where we're looking at building tools and sort of both technical and actually social infrastructure for this work to reduce the labor and also put groups in touch with each other so they can learn about best practices. So yeah, because once you put them in a room, the activists get really excited talking about like spreadsheet tricks and macros and stuff like that. So it's really kind of awesome to see. So just to posit that, that's the sort of future direction that my work is headed in. So I think I have so many other examples, but I want to hear from Giselle, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So I think the last thing I'll say is that, one of the main points of our book, and it may be obvious from the examples, is that data feminism really insists on an expanded definition of data science. So our data science isn't defined by the size of the data set. It's not defined by the credentials of the people who are undertaking the work. These are things that are continually used to exclude women and people of color from the field, as well as to exclude work whose contribution is socio-technical rather than purely technical. But if we expand our definition of data science, then what we can see really clearly is some of the most exciting work at the intersection of data science and justice today is being undertaken by artists, by journalists, humanists, librarians, community organizers, activists, and social movements, and so on. And so some of that work looks like traditional data science, and we feature a lot of kind of traditional sort of academic data science projects in our book. But then some of them are art projects, like we have a data sculpture here, or some of them are data journalism projects. Some of them are community-based murals. So this is a mural called a data mural here at the bottom that was done in collaboration with a community-based organization. And so we try to showcase this range of examples to say that, you know, on the one hand, from a critical perspective, we know that data is at the root of many problems today, or at least it's sort of exacerbating existing problems in important ways. But at the same time, data can be part of the solution if we can figure out these more emancipatory ways of working with it and transforming sort of both our institutions and our projects and the larger world at the same time. Oh yeah, and just to plug, we were invited to put data feminism in like an exhibition, so we didn't know how to exhibit a book. So we worked with a designer named Barsha Diaz, who's fantastic, and made these data feminism infographics, which we invite you to download for free if you are interested in them. We have a page on our website and you can go download them in a number of languages. And yeah, and then here's a number of ways to be in touch. We love to hear from people who are using data feminism and who found it useful. So please, yeah, do get in touch. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you for that, Catherine. Thank you very much. So there were a couple of comments in the chat as you were talking. Alan Dix wrote major social justice conflicts in data collection. For example, last year in the UK, both analysis of BMME COVID death and impact of teacher-assigned grades struggled due to lack of data because reasonably protected characteristics were not gathered. I guess that's a comment. I don't know if you'd like to comment or follow on.
Sure. Yeah, this is tricky. And I would say this is an unresolved tension, like an unresolved ethical tension in the data space regarding like when do we collect data about these different identity characteristics, whether that's gender data, race data, sexuality data, cisgender or transgender status data. And so like this is, you know, on the one hand, there are important reasons for not collecting, which could be, you know, if we imagine something like, you know, collecting data about whether somebody is transgender or not, you are asking them to disclose something to an institution who they may or may not trust, who may or may not want to target them for something, you know, and so like many transgender data activists advocate for like not ever collecting gender data, just or at least the whether someone's trans or not. And yet on the other hand, you have sort of large sort of gender data nonprofit organizations who are really advocating for pushing for a gender perspective, because when we don't look at gender, let's say in international development data or something like this, we can really miss important gender differences that result. So it might result that like, you know, some particular policy like sort of looks great on paper, but in fact is quite harmful to women or something like this. And so I would just say it's like an unresolved tension. And then there's like a kind of third thing in there too. And I don't know how this works in the UK, but like, and this may relate to the example that you're bringing up, which is that law, legal sort of this idea of like these protected characteristics often results because the law, at least in the US, anti-discrimination law tries to be sort of like race blind, sort of color blind and gender blind. And there's ways in which potentially that helps, I don't know, but then there's also important ways in which it obscures our ability to see racialized difference. So it's like, even if we agree that race is this like very slippery category, and like really same with gender as well, that is not scientific, is not biological, is not essential, there's important ways for you know, activist and advocacy reasons that we do want those data so that we can demand equity, right? And so I think that's, so I don't have a firm answer, because I think it's like the path forward is always very context specific, as we talk about in the book. But there's not a clean answer, I don't think, about like what to collect, when to collect it, and about whom. And there are important ways where we do want race and gender data, and there are important times when we do not want race and gender data to be collected.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's complex, and I guess it speaks to that tension that you were talking about earlier around you know, being counted, and actually the situations when being counted can expose people to all sorts of vulnerabilities, and I guess the question there that comes to mind is to do what do we need to put in place to ensure that people have the capabilities to be aware of what does it mean to be counted or not counted, and when, and how as well. But there are more questions, so I'm going to move on to the next questions as well. So Catherine Margaret Pasco says, thank you very much for this amazing presentation, and I look forward to reading your book soon. It is interesting to see how many of the principles you highlighted I already integrate into my research practice, particularly questioning power in access to data, cleaning data, data silencing, and who has control over the data, as well as upholding the centrality of context. Could you possibly expand further on what is covered with the principle of making labor visible in data science?
Sure. That's great to hear you're integrating all of these into your practice. That's wonderful. In that chapter, Lauren and I are talking a lot about the ways in which, again, the sort of narratives around data science and AI, and also the products of data science and AI, kind of stuff like, you can think of things like Alexa or Siri, or platforms like Uber, the ways in which they obscure the human labor behind the scenes. So it all appears to work sort of seamlessly and magically automated. It all appears to not involve human beings. It appears to be the work of the algorithms. But in fact, really important work has shown how, oh, and we're told that everything lives in the cloud, you know what I mean? Which is like a total lie. Like the things live in remote, cheaply rentable spaces that use lots of air conditioning to keep the servers cool. So like Facebook's, one of Facebook's data centers runs up like a $31 million electricity bill every single month, for example, right? And so there are ways in which the all of the both human labor and environmental costs and material aspects that make our technologies and platforms go are hidden. And so you know, there's long-standing feminist work that's about this concept of invisible labor. So it's sort of all that labor has been sort of invisibilized and it's not apparent to us. So what we call for in that chapter is thinking about ways that we can make that labor visible. Sometimes on the planetary scale, if that's the scale you work at, but it can even be as simple as thinking about like kind of what has gone in to making whatever project that you're working on, whose labor has gone into that, and how do we credit and source that appropriately, and kind of also just like having looking backwards. Like often when we, you know, you go out and you acquire data, like you're like, okay, I'm going to do the project about blah, I'm going to acquire this data. We are not often taught to think backwards. Where did those data come from? Who generated them? Under which circumstances? Like who took care of them? Like where did they live? in a place-based way, like literally like what city were they in, you know? And so we don't often ask those questions, but kind of starting to think of those questions of like, we inherit these things that are at a certain stage of their life cycle, but they have this whole life before they get to us. And so how do we like adequately document that life? And then also how do we credit all of the human beings that touched those at different points and created them, as well as all the people who work on maybe our own team that are under-recognized and under-credited for their work. So, yeah.
Right, thank you. And yeah, of course, making data, the labor visible would also play a big, or it would be the start to perhaps even change the perception of what we think as data being, and the magic, that what appears to be almost magic, and rather not the case. One more question from Michael Muller, who was one of our speakers at the start of the week. Hi, Michael, thank you for joining us again. So he says, I'd like to hear more about the concept of data silences. Are these silences a matter of forgetting, of suppressing, of enforced silence? So Michael, at the beginning of the week, gave a talk around the data pipeline and the different moments of forgetting and remembrance that happens in what is a rather complex process, having lots of different groups working at different times on different aspects.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, we talk about data silences and also this idea of missing data. We talk about, kind of use those terms interchangeably. And yeah, I think it's interesting to think about why the data are missing. I think there are a variety of reasons in play, and you should definitely go check out Mimi Onuoha's work, because she's written, I think just on the GitHub page that describes her project, she's written about this in a really lovely way. But then sometimes, I mean, I would say it's like all of the things that you posit, actually. So sometimes it's a matter of incentives and or political will. So like in the book, we talk about how, for example, you know, Target knows which of its customers are pregnant because, you know, there's this like famous case from, now it's a while ago, like 8 years ago or something, where Target was able to infer the pregnancy status of their customers based on their purchases so that they could like sell them more stuff. And so like, that's like a data-driven research question that's interesting to Target. So like they know all this pregnancy status information about their customers. As we contrast that with the fact that in the United States, we don't have a comprehensive registry of maternal mortality. So we actually don't know how many women, parents are dying in childbirth each year. And so like, why is that, right? Like, why do we, and it's because of profit, right? So it's like, it's because there is profit incentive to know about pregnancy status, and no one's profiting about these like public health questions, basically, right? And not to, which is not to say that it's correct. We should be like rectifying that immediately. And there's lots of people who have been working on that. But you know, there's a number of sort of misaligned incentives. And then there are places where the government, like the institution who should be responsible for these things, actively or politically doesn't agree that those things should be counted. And so like this would be the example of police killings in the United States. And so it's still, I believe, the case that data journalism organizations like The Guardian and The Washington Post have more comprehensive federal registries of citizens who've been killed by police than any database that the US government has. And it's partially due to how policing works in the United States. It's like at the municipal level, there's like 37,000 police, you know, municipalities. It's really hard to aggregate up from there, but also, you know, the federal government could do it if it really wanted to, you know? And so I think there's that as well, where there's a kind of active, I would say like active disinvestment because it's not politically expedient, nor do they want to acknowledge that they're recognizing something enough as a phenomenon to care to measure it. And that's sort of the case in the case of the feminist side as well. And then there are things that where there are, I think, subpopulations that are so small, let's say in numbers, that then they literally don't, their concerns are not heard and don't bubble up to the counting institutions who might be open to taking them into account, but there's this kind of ignorance, basically. So those are some of their, I mean, I think the reasons are many. I think it's a really interesting thing to kind of think about in each case, why, because they're social and political and sometimes technical, sometimes organizational, et cetera, reasons.
Thank you. And Michael says thank you too. Great. So I think we should probably move on now so that there is time at the end to bring you both together. So Giselle, I'd like to welcome you. Thank you very much for joining us. Giselle Cory will draw in her talk from DataKind UK experience supporting social change organizations to use data science. She'll talk about real life case studies from charities, local governments, and social enterprises across the UK. Giselle Cory is Executive Director of DataKind UK, a charity that supports other charities to use data science through a community of pro bono data scientists. DataKind UK has supported hundreds of charities to make better use of data over its nearly 10 years working in the UK. Giselle has spent over a decade working in social change organizations, from government to national charities and think tanks. They believe that smart, responsible data collection and use can help the social tech sector tackle some of the UK's biggest challenges. Thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that intro, and it is wonderful to be here. Thank you, Catherine, so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. Just anyone who's thinking about investing, on my bookshelf, one of my favorites. Yes, it's open access, but I'm a big fan of being able to page turn and fold corners over and scribble in margins and do other things which might make people's skin crawl. So I invested, and it's definitely worth it. It's an absolutely wonderful piece. So thank you for bringing that into the world. So I'm going to talk a bit today about, as I've been introduced, about data science in the social sector. I have some slides that I am going to bring up to do that. There we go. Let me know, please shout if you can't see that slide saying, what role does data science have in the social sector? Oh, let me take note of the time, 10 to. So I'm going to talk about this today, broken into these three chunks. So what we do and why, a bit about DataKind's work, some examples from the social sector, so how data science is used at present, and how we make sure it's responsible, and some of the ethical considerations we take on all our projects and some of the challenges that come up along the way. But firstly, who are we? We're a charity that builds data science capacity in social change organisations, so charities, local authorities, public sector bodies, social enterprises, any organisation that's aiming for social good as its bottom line. We're here to help build that data science capacity. We do that in a few different ways. We do that via our office hours programme, which is a drop-in where any of those social change organisations can come along and say, help, my code's broken, or I really want to do this thing in Excel and I don't know how, or I've heard data strategy might be a good idea for my organization, but I don't know what it means. Any of a broad range of questions, and they can get some expertise from one of our support providers. We do data dives. These are exploratory. We'll work with an organization for a couple of months to help them figure out what their questions might be. So often organizations will come and say, we want to understand our programs better, want to understand the services we provide to individuals and communities better, and we'll help them go from that question to something that's a bit more like a tech spec, so something that you can use to really offer sharp questions to the data that organisation has. Data core, and so very exploratory. A data core, on the other hand, we have American roots. So this is a data version of a Peace Corps. I think slightly cringeworthy language, but nonetheless is what we're used to. So a data core is different from the previous stuff I've talked about in that it's not exploratory. It's essentially the next step. It's more of a deployment step. So it's saying, okay, as a charity, we've done this project. We've realised that we'd really like a model to assess the greatest levels of need among individuals that come to us, and we want this model to be working day to day as part of, as a tool that our workforce use, but we need a bit of help implementing that. So we'll work with that organisation for often up to a year to get that done. Data people in social sector organisations are growing in number, but still remain somewhat isolated often. You'll often find people working on their own in data teams. So to provide a bit of support, we've kind of organically grown this thing we call the Social Data Society. It's a peer network of people who use data, and so it's essentially technical people working in charities where they can provide support and advice to each other. And then finally, responsible data. This isn't a program we run. It's a thread that runs through all our programs. And here I've put some work we did with the Ada Lovelace Institute on algorithmic auditing. It's a thread that's kind of essentially not at all a bolt-on, but unfortunately, because of sometimes the way data science is applied in the world, needs to be underlined and referred to, and we need to always remind ourselves and everyone we work with that it's an essential component of any project, any data project that's undertaken. So that's a bit about what we do, but who do we work with? Here's is a bit of a logo mess, but just to give you an idea of the kind of charity partners we work with. So you'll recognise, I'm sure, some big national names there, largely service delivery charities. So they're literally offering a service to individuals or communities or groups. Some national, some local, some campaigning organisations kind of creep in sometimes, though they remain a minority of the organisations we support. The other, this is an essential half of DataKind, but the other half of DataKind, equally as essential, is our community. So everything I've just talked about that we provide because of pro bono data scientists. So they give their evenings and weekends and sometimes a cheeky afternoon here and there away from their paid work to support social change organisations through DataKind programmes. They're amazing, we love them. This is some of them back when we did stuff in person. This is a data dive, as you can see from the t-shirts on the right. It was with an organisation called Meningitis Now, as well as an organisation called Stop the Traffic. So that's what we do, but why do we do it? So data science is incredibly powerful. I'd imagine we're probably all in agreement with that, but at the moment, essentially for-profit organisations rather than not-for-profit organisations have a monopoly on it. In terms of access to data science skills, but also in terms of the kind of approaches that have developed over time, very much hinged on and focused on the needs of corporate entities rather than of social change organisations. We think that if some of those skills, some of those approaches were used by social change organisations, maybe edited and used by social change organisations, then those organisations could transform their impact. It's probably intuitive, I'd imagine, to a lot of this audience that there's this data stuff can be quite useful, but it's perhaps we don't want to just use it to make sure we buy the right pair of shoes on Amazon or we get recommended the next best track on Spotify. That all well and good, but perhaps we also want to see if we can use that to really solve some of our greatest social problems. So that's what we seek to do. You might ask why we need to play this role. So why does an organisation like DataKind exist when data science is already out there? Social change organisations are out there. Can't they meet each other? We find there are a few barriers to that happening. In fact, I've got some of them written up here. So too little of senior buy-in, of awareness of financial incentives, too much fear and technical debt. So what I mean by each of these, so too little senior buy-in, we find often charitable organisations won't necessarily have data analytics, data science, data informed approaches in mind, essentially, in their senior echelons or in their board of trustees, and they might know what those techniques can do, but be worried about what they can do because they associate data science and data use with names like Cambridge Analytica, or as the second point here, they might not be aware actually of the power of data analytics and data science, and so not quite realise the opportunity that could be gained. And then lack of financial incentives. So the social sector works off a really diverse range of income streams, but largely from grants from trusts and foundations, and to a degree from money from government, from commission services where government gives charities contracts to do stuff. In neither case is good use of data incentivized. So we still, whereas in I think in some corporate settings, we might incentivize the use of data to test things, like simple things like A/B testing. If you're doing an email campaign to get people to click something or buy something, that kind of testing crops up in charities in fundraising departments of the bigger charities, but it very rarely crops up in operational settings, so in delivering services. So the incentivization by funders to ask questions like, is your service supporting groups differently? Are people having different outcomes depending on who they are or where they come from? These kind of, and how could we change those outcomes, shift those outcomes? That funders aren't great at asking those questions, which means there aren't financial incentives to be super data informed. And then too much fear, too much technical debt. What's the time? So there is a lot of fear around misuse of data. There's a lot of fear around getting on the wrong side of the law. GDPR, I think, is or the UK equivalent now is wonderful, but was not super well understood in the social sector. So there's a lot of concern over doing the wrong thing and getting fined by the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, but more to the point, getting taken out to it kind of having that dirty laundry washed in public, and getting hung out to dry by the sector, and losing the kind of reputation you have of a safe keeper of sensitive data. And that I don't think that fear's badly placed. It's organisations that support the most vulnerable should definitely be worried about keeping the data safe of those individuals and communities. But if that fear can't be tackled and balanced with information and support, that's when you have a bit of a barrier. And lastly, technical debt. Organisations might want to use the data they have, but they might not be able to get at it. They might have a bad CRM where it's locked away and no one knows how to use it, and legacy systems where you can't easily put together different data on different program outcomes, for example, because it's all in different formats. That stuff is that is not a footnote on the page of social progress. It's a massive challenge for organisations who are resource poor and might not have the funds or know how to overcome some of those challenges. So that's a bit about why we're here. I'm now going to move on to what we do, or the challenges we see. So the essentially social sector use cases. And normally at this point I'd go through and I'd show loads of like charts of different examples and the data that were the kind of answers to data questions that organizations had found via us. Because this is a bit of a micro presentation today, I'm going to instead just go through the categories of the type of questions that we get asked and then refer to a few examples as we go. So I'm going to put these all on at once and then go through them. There we go. So these are the 4 big categories of question that we tend to get asked by the organisations who want to be supported by DataKind. So I'm going to read them out. Understanding beneficiaries and communities. So for example, who are our beneficiaries or service users? What is the unmet need? So who should be working, we should be working with that we're not? Understanding services. So how do people interact with us as charitable service providers? Evaluating services. So what's the impact of our services? Are we doing any good? Are we doing what we think we're doing? And then finally, optimizing services. So what works for whom and why? Put the and why in brackets, because that's usually a bit of a stretch goal. And then how can we spot and respond to the greatest needs? So, and I'm sure there are things outside of these categories that we will deal with sometimes and that might come along in future, but this really encapsulates the absolute vast majority of the questions organisations bring to us. And just to give a bit of colour on some of these things, so who are our beneficiaries? Organisations might want to look at the data they have on the people who've interacted with them in the last couple of years to do things that, if you're a kind of a technical person sitting here in the room, you might think is kind of entry level stuff. So they might want to do things like segment by age or gender or where people are coming from, what people are doing in their outside of the service use, so in their day jobs or in their communities. These kind of things, just a kind of looking at if their users are older, younger, etc. This is very often this kind of question, particularly in less data mature organisations, that wouldn't have been answered yet. So just looking at segment or kind of cutting data by that kind of group is incredibly useful for organisations. And then comparing unmet needs. So for example, we worked recently with Citizens Advice. They're a federation of information, advice and guidance providers. We worked with a Lewisham branch. We've actually worked with a few, but this example from the Lewisham branch, they wanted to know if the people who sought their support, if those people's addresses essentially correlated with areas that were more or less deprived within the London Borough of Lewisham. They're funded and they exist to provide support to people who have less access to support nets elsewhere. So they're looking to, essentially as a proxy, they're looking to provide information to those people in more deprived areas. And if they're not doing that, then they need to think about access and if it's a case of limited access to their services in certain places, or if it's simply a case of people not needing to use them. So they used open data on indices of multiple deprivation and compared it with their proprietary data, their service and beneficiary data, to see if those two things showed that there was an overlap or a mismatch between deprivation and service use. And they found actually it was they were very pleasantly surprised that there was a significant overlap in those two things, but found a few areas where they suspected there was some unmet need and that they could probably make sure to advertise themselves better in. So that's a bit of an example of the first bucket. What's an example of the second bucket, understanding services? So for this one, actually there's an interesting case of a organisation that we've recently done a project with called CAP. That stands for Christians Against Poverty. They're a national debt relief organisation, and they were really interested in how they could ensure that the journey that their beneficiaries took when they interacted with the organisation was basically as the least onerous it could be. When you're a debt advice and support organisation, you essentially take on the debt of the individuals you're supporting and help manage it with them. That's a lot of information there. There's probably a quite complex pathway to getting that support. And CAP said, is there a way that we can understand that we can better basically predict who's going to need what, and therefore not put them through a billion hurdles if they're not going to benefit from doing that. And they found that they could use prediction, use it like a fairly simple kind of prediction model to understand what services people were likely to need in most cases. That didn't mean that if you were predicted something, you needed something, that's all you'd get. It just meant they could say, okay, it looks like this person's going to end up needing this particular service. Let's not put them through all the hoops associated with that different service. So that helped them understand a bit how people interacted with them and streamline that process. In terms of that third bucket, evaluating services. So this is the big question for charitable services. It's, it's a bit easier when you're a for-profit and you essentially evaluate your services by looking at different, usually different pound amounts associated with different activities. For charitable services, it's often quite complex and long-term outcomes, and you need proxies for those outcomes, like whether someone did or didn't go through a particular program successfully might be a proxy for if that person is more likely to be employable in the future, for example. And charitable services will pretty much always collect that data, but not always use it, and not always, if they are using it, not always dig above the top the top headlines. And that's just, again, a case of a lot of organizations being quite resource constrained. So an example of going in depth there is working with Clara, who are a Welsh charity working to reduce youth homelessness. They knew their overall level of that they call success, that people essentially having good outcomes from their programs, but they were interested in who doesn't do well in their services, not just overall, but by using segmentation. So they said, how can we usefully segment users? Essentially, this means make groups, but make a slightly more complex groups than just if someone's younger or older, for example. And they said, we'll make groups depending on whether people have had interactions with the care system. So for the age, they were looking at whether someone's a care leaver or not, by whether someone's had interactions as a youth offender with criminal justice system, and then by gender. I'm just trying to think actually if it's sex or gender, because I can't remember, but I believe it was gender. And wanted to see by those groups whether what the impact of the programs were. And they found that for people who were care leavers and had been youth offenders and were male, they had about a third saying that they had really positive outcomes from a project, this particular project. But if you were female, not a care leaver, not a youth offender, it was more like 3/4 saying they had positive outcomes. So for them, looking across those two groups and seeing that quite stark difference in positive outcomes in their programs was really quite an exciting thing to be able to do, and a very empowering thing for them to be able to do with their service level data for the first time. And once they knew that technique was something they could do, they can go ahead and replicate it for other services and for those services at other points of time in the future. And finally, in optimizing, a very quick optimizing services. This one is really interesting because it's something a lot of organizations want to do, but often something that isn't quite right to do until you've done a bunch of these other things that are on this slide, actually. Because there can be essentially some risks associated with the misuse of some of the optimization approaches. I'll talk a bit more about that later. But one example of optimizing service use was worked with a food bank up in the north, up in Huddersfield, who were seeing a pattern of increased dependence on their service. So that for those who aren't super familiar with the food bank system in the UK, they are sticking plasters. They're designed and intended to be sticking plasters largely. This food bank definitely was. Most food banks are. And long-term use is not seen as ideal, because essentially long-term use means the person who's using the food bank is stuck and it's not getting through the bad patch they're going through. So for the food bank, they'd see long-term, they basically repeat custom, not good. Unlike a lot of other services that we're used to in life, you don't want to see people coming back over and over again, because it means they're having a prolonged tough time. So they ensured they got funding for a support worker, someone who could provide support to the people who were coming back over and over again and help them unstick themselves from whatever difficult situations they were going through, perhaps activate other government services that weren't stepping in as they should be to support those individuals. But the problem was, one support worker, thousands of people coming to the food bank. How do you possibly create a queue for that person that isn't infinite, essentially? So they said, for this, is that an optimization problem? Can they understand from the data they get on the individuals, which is very rich in food banks, because food banks are referral services by and large. So they're with the referrer, usually a GP, for example, or someone else working in a government-run service, will provide, with the consent of the individual, a bunch of data about them. Can they use that information to understand if that person's very likely to get stuck or less likely to get stuck? And if they are very likely to get stuck, give them support as soon as possible so that you reduce the trauma and difficulty associated with this very difficult period in that person's life, rather than leave them waiting, knowing that they're likely not to be able to dig themselves out without that support. In this case, with this food bank, they could do that. They, with our help, found that actually, I think probably not ideal, but the reality was they could predict with a really high degree of certainty who was going to need that extra support, and they prioritized those individuals, and they saw their average returning rate drop after they did that. So for them, that was something to be proud of, kind of a really good testament to the fact that their support worker could help people, could help unstick people from the troubles they were having, if that support worker was put in front of that individual in need in good time. They, as a side note, the support worker in this case was super cynical about the use of data science for in that situation, and at first kind of gave a bit of side eye to this this model producing this suggestion on whether someone should go to the front of the queue or not, and over time essentially noted what the model said and noted what assessment they made, and kind of calibrated, and they, in this case, they found that they were kind of in agreement with the model, so they became more comfortable using it as an aid to their decision making. So that is I'm probably a bit over time. So that is just some very quick examples of some of the ways that you can apply these techniques in the social sector. It's not everything, it's not designed to be comprehensive, but hopefully gives you just a bit of colour of some of the applications. These and you'd have heard it from what I've just said, that a lot of this isn't flashy. Yes, there are some wonderful computer vision projects to understand what roofs, the quality of someone's roof might mean for whether or not that person needs support from a particular NGO or not. Very flashy, can be very impactful. What we find most organisations need is not that. In fact, if you provided that, I think it would be pretty irresponsible, because you're not providing the building blocks for that organisation to be data mature and to really continue to use those techniques in a kind of sustained, responsible manner. What do I got next? Actually, that is a great segue, because next I am going to talk, in fact, about some of the challenges we have in ensuring that the organisations we work with are using data responsibly. And I've got here, you'll see, so I've got my little blue cards and my red cards, and I think I've got about 6 or 7 of these, and they reflect kind of the flip side of the same situation. And I'm just going to go through each and just talk about some of the things we come up against kind of day to day, week to week. So the first challenge is this data informed versus data driven. And so data informed for me means that an organization is literally being informed by data and applications of data use within their organization. Being data driven is more kind of computer says no. It's being led by the decisions being made by a model or algorithm, for example. I think there might be circumstances, I don't know of many, but there might be circumstances where you want to be entirely data driven in a kind of charitable service delivery context. I think they are few and far between. We are talking largely about services that are dealing with some of the most vulnerable people in some of the most disadvantaged communities across the UK for our international charity partners across the world, and there might be other things that need to be taken into account in deciding how you best support those organisations, not those communities and individuals, not least the voice of those communities and individuals. So for us, that any kind of data analytics, data science approaches need to be taken alongside user voices, alongside subject matter expertise, if those two groups differ, alongside the history and wisdom of the organisations involved, and alongside the strategic direction an organisation might want to go in, because actually it might be the particular charity, yes, you recognise that for example, men are particularly affected by topic X, but it might be that actually the vision and values of the organisation are to support women, and so keeping that all in the balance, I think, is pretty important, and we never say kind of take the data and that's it. Second one, collect to use, collect to sell. I mean, obvious kind of differentiation there. We haven't seen yet a lot of kind of collect to sell happening in the social sector, but I suspect it will happen more as social sector organisations kind of mature, basically, in their use of data, and that will mean they have richer data sets, more nuanced data sets, and I think that there's a lot of challenges associated with any kind of third degree interactions with those data sets, given that they represent very because of the communities and individuals they represent, but also because of the significant need for trust for those vulnerable individuals to interact with those organisations, and the importance of maintaining and developing that trusting relationship. Third one, better target support versus target easiest to help. So in the case where I just talked about, in the case of the food bank, identifying who would need support, they could, if I just absolutely can't imagine them doing this, but an organisation could have said, we're going to use this model to decide who to turn away, and those people who need more support, we're going to turn them away, because hey, you know what, if we do that, suddenly our evaluation numbers look great. Suddenly 100% of the people using our services are going to be achieving everything that they set out to achieve, because the people who might have not looked so good to against their evaluation metrics didn't get through the door. It's an incredible risk, and it's ourselves as DataKind absolutely no way we can entirely proof what we do against that risk, because when we work with an organization to increase their data science capacity, but once we're gone, they can take any direction that they see fit, but we can mitigate for that kind of decision making, and we do that by essentially a lot of responsible data use elements built into our projects, and we make sure we're having the kind of useful conversations with the right people in the organization at the right time, to ensure that there's a good kind of confident ethical approach to data use. A decisions versus fully automate. So not only because of how the law is structured, but because of what we think is responsible use of data, we would always ensure that anything created like that, the model in the food bank, was alongside that support worker's decision on what they do and don't do with any particular client or beneficiary. This, and I think this is another tricky one because of humans, because we might start with a system that A's decisions rather than makes it for us, but if over time we realize that we're in alignment most of the time, then why wouldn't we just entirely hand over that process to kind of computer says yes, computer says no. So that's another thing where we try and make sure that the systems that any data approach sit in are systems where where there's essentially kind of safeguards in place to mean that doesn't happen. Explain it versus hide it. We've seen this in the corporate world. We've seen organisations play out this decision in possibly not the most ideal way sometimes. The circumstance I've talked about already in charities, and that essentially the need to work in a very trusting manner with the individuals and communities that organisation seeks to work alongside, means that this isn't a decision. I think you have to explain, and if you're not willing to explain and be transparent about the approaches that you're using, why aren't you? If there might be a good reason essentially behind why you're not happy explaining, and that's great. Go with that and stop doing what you're doing. Last one, increase equity versus reinforce bias. So with, again, going back to the food bank example, just because the last one that was talked about, you could have a model that takes into account race, for example, in a certain area where people of a particular race struggle more than others, and become dependent on food banks because of other issues in that area associated with their race. So bias in the job market, for example. You want to make sure anything you do doesn't simply reinforce that. I mean, I think I don't need to labour this point, because I suspect the audience for this kind of talk will be well versed on this already. If you haven't, if you are a Netflix user and you haven't already, then watch Coded Bias. It's wonderful. And read anything Ruha Benjamin writes as well. I'd recommend that. Look up the Algorithmic Justice League. But again, really important in the charity sector because of the nature of the work that we do. So I'm going to skip these two, and my last slide here, because I am over time, I need to stop, is just to zoom out. So what, and I'm going to stop sharing because you don't need to stare at the word zoom out. So one thing I talk about a lot with organizations that come to DataKind is whether this data stuff is what they need. So we go through some of the situations and potential implications that I've talked about over the last little while. But actually, before we do all that, we say, are you ready? Are you ready for the use of data in this way? Because it could be that actually the organization isn't quite kind of data mature enough. So any advanced technique that might be implemented in the organization will, for example, not be updated over time. And then you've got an aging model, and that's bad because it's probably wrong. And also, is data the solution? Is this a values question? And you have to go back to your board of trustees. Is this a question around how you might want to kind of implement a service, and is actually much more about decisions around what works with staff than it is around what works according to your data, etc. So really, the first question we do ask when people want to do data projects is it actually a data project? Let's kind of have a bit of a deeper look. I'm going to wrap up there and hope to dig into some questions. One last thing to say is I've said we are a volunteer run organisation. If that sounds like you, and you have quant skills, ethics skills, project management skills that you want to bring to bear on some of the UK social challenges, please do just look us up at datakind.org.uk, and you'll see all the relevant information on our website.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Giselle, for your talk and presentation. I'm really aware of the time. We've got a hard finish in 3 minutes. So I think we'll probably have, there were some questions for you, Giselle, and I think it would be unfair not to ask them. So I think I'll dive straight in. So Ben Wilson asks, It could be hard enough, but not impossible, to convince not-profit to work past the lack of money incentive or be offered a route around their mountain of technical debt. But it must be a different challenge to overcome their fear. Do you have particular approaches to building trust, or is it less of a problem because people have come to you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm so sorry. I realised I'd gone quite so much over time. I'm kicking myself because I'm really looking forward to that discussion. Building trust. Yeah, I mean, organisations tend to come to us partly because we don't have a marketing budget. So that's really the only way organisations come across us. And it's a lot of word of mouth. So often it's someone working in a charity talks to someone else working in a different charity and says, come speak to these guys. So there's trust in the relationship working with us. I think the challenge going forward it tends to be one of in their organisation. So building trust and interest and support among their peers, among their managers and the powers that be, etc. And that can often be quite hard. We tend to I think kind of advocate two approaches there. The first is just being on a really firm legal footing, because often that's the big barrier, and we can point. I'm not a data law expert. I know enough to be confident in the basics, and then I'll hand over to usually like pro bono legal support that we've got networks into, and say, you know, if you don't have X and Y in place, here you go speak to these people, they'll help you. And the second thing is cut myself out of the conversation completely and link someone in charity X and with someone in charity Y if they're in different stages, so that the person who's a bit behind can hear from the person who's a bit ahead, and about their challenges and what they have and haven't done, and not from some third party who's not doing it every day.
Okay. Thank you, Giselle. It is 7:29, so I might ask. We've got 1 minute to go, so I'll perhaps ask Catherine to join in as well, and perhaps leave us with one last thought that you might want to share with our audience this evening, around ways to work, perhaps the most effective ways to work with communities in a bottom-up way, as you both are working in this way, to use data science tools in a way that can reflect their complex realities.
Sure, I'll jump in maybe.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say I really appreciate, Giselle, your presentation, and I appreciate the work of DataKind, because sometimes in this space it can feel like, you know, there's so many problems, and sometimes when you present people with all these problems, they can get very overwhelmed and feel like they can't do anything. So I think it's a really great reminder of like how we can be very intentional about how we move forward with data, and always asking the right questions. It's like including questions of like when data are not necessary, you know, and that's always an option, is to like not need data. And so I think that's maybe some advice for working with communities, is remembering to put data in their place. Like, you know, if a community-based organization or nonprofit is working with data, it's usually not their reason for existing, you know. It's usually because they're doing some larger other social mission that they want to accomplish, and data is some very small sort of mechanical part of that. And so it's like a kind of practice that can be improved. There are lots of ethical and also technical things to think about, but remembering ultimately that it's not about the data. I think where folks can go wrong when they start to do community-based or participatory work is imagining that they're in the position of being like this, of like benevolent paternalism. Like, I know everything and I'm going to share it with you. I'm going to like bestow my wisdom or bestow my technology on you. And I think that's just the absolute wrong way to enter the conversation. So at least in my own participatory and community-based work, you know, it's sort of entering the conversation, always listening and trying to figure out like, well, where can I am a developer, like I make software systems, you know, and so like, but like, where can those software systems be built so that they fit into what people are already doing, and also, you know, work on building folks' technical and data literacy at the same time. So I think just like remembering to put it in the place, not centering the data, you know, not centering yourself. Those are sort of my words of advice, I guess.
Thank you. Giselle, do you like to share one last thought before we close?
I think everything Catherine said, under the exclamation mark. Yeah, talking about in what we do, it's ridiculous that we spend a lot of at least a lot of our branding time like putting data first, and actually it's you know, if you were thinking about any other way of kind of supporting individuals, it would be you'd be making sure you put the outcomes first of those individuals. But I think something weird happens when we talk about data, and suddenly folks go, okay, data, there must be something in there, and people just kind of want to mine data sets and just find interesting things and do stuff to that data with that data because you can and because it's fun, and I get that. I'm a data scientist, I like that too, but it's not about the data. It's about how that data use affects people, what you're trying to achieve for in our case for the kind of people using the services of your within charities and other social change organizations. So yeah, very much kind of taking a step back away from it. That doesn't mean then that when we do use data that we don't need to be very thoughtful, and there's a lot of I've lost the word for holes on the road. I can't remember. There's a lot of things you can fall into, and traps you can fall into, and some of them we know about, and some of them we don't know about. Some of them we know about now, but we weren't aware of 5 years ago, which is why I think the work of Catherine and others is so invaluable, because this space is forever changing, and what is okay, what is deemed okay, what others will tell you is acceptable, that you've done with the data about them, changes over time, and we need to keep being thoughtful about that and make sure that that's evolving in the right direction, I think.
Great, thank you very much, Giselle. Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you all on the other side of the screen who we cannot see for joining us this evening. And I hope this has given you lots of food for thoughts and things to look forward to do in the future. So have a good evening, everyone, and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.